Welcome to the Lab to Table podcast, brought to you by Mariu Nutrisciences. In a world where the food industry is constantly evolving, we're here to help you break down the complexities. Join us as we sit down with some of the industry's leading experts to tackle critical food safety updates, decode shifting consumer trends, and deliver the actionable insights you need to stay ahead.
Hey everybody, and thanks for listening in to another episode of Lab to Table. Back with us again today is Anna Benavente, our labeling and regulatory expert, and we are going to discuss the major shift in how food ingredients are brought to market in the United States. Just earlier this week, the FDA proposed a new rule that will convert the voluntary GRAS notification program into a mandatory one. So effectively ending the era of secret, independent self-affirmation. So Anna, welcome back. And right off the bat, can you tell us about this rule? What prompted this major regulatory shift by the FDA?
Yeah. Hey, Mark. Feels like it was just last week we were talking about this and anticipating when this might come out. It's quite groundbreaking, but it has been in the works for a while. It did come early, though. As you and I were discussing in the last podcast that we did, it had been earmarked for December publication, but lo and behold, Monday morning, bright and early, they made the announcement that they were issuing this proposed rule. And as you noted, it impacts the voluntary GRAS notification program. And this is part of that whole MAHA movement, part of the initiative from the new administration to address what they characterize as a loophole in food regulation. And this is the ability for companies to self-affirm that a substance is generally recognized as safe and not file a food additive petition or submit a GRAS notification. So only a voluntary notification program has been in place. And when companies did submit this, FDA would issue either a letter that they had no questions about the company's assertion that it was GRAS. They would issue sometimes an insufficient basis for a GRAS conclusion if they didn't think the data was sufficient, or if they also would allow companies to cease to evaluate. So a company, if they didn't have sufficient data, in some cases might ask FDA to just stop evaluating it, and FDA would grant that without issuing a final letter. And so it's been seen by critics as a loophole allowing, unscrupulous companies to flood our food system with dangerous chemicals that harm the public. And so there's been a lot of criticism around this. So what this rule does is it makes that GRAS notice mandatory, no longer voluntary, in essence, eliminating that self-affirmation process for GRAS substances. So this GRAS notice would be mandatory for new substances entering the market. The rule then also outlines a streamlined process for GRAS substances that are currently on the market. So this is kind of another interesting aspect. Early speculation was that there might be a grandfather clause for self-affirmed substances in the marketplace now, but that's not the case. There will be this different process that those substances and the companies that market them will have to follow. Some other really kind of interesting parts of this rule, too, is that it specifically calls out and grants FDA authority to repeal an affirmation that was previously made by the agency that a substance was GRAS. So some of the more controversial ingredients out there like BHT, BHA, they have GRAS affirmations from the agency, but this rule is going to let FDA repeal those. It will also allow FDA to follow up with questions to someone who already got a no questions letter for their GRAS notice and allow the agency to later determine that it's not GRAS and rescind that letter. So, whereas before, FDA kind of had this sort of implied they had this sort of authority, now it's specifically spelled out. Also, we tend to kind of talk about this in reference to human food, but all of this applies to animal food and food contact substances as well.
As usual, there might be some exceptions to the rule. So are there any exceptions where a mandatory GRAS notice is not required?
There are, and they, thankfully, and they make perfect sense, but it's really good that they're all spelled out as well. So if your substance is listed in 21 CFR 182, 184, or 186 as having already been affirmed by FDA as GRAS, then you're kosher, you're covered. Also, if you had a no questions letter from FDA due to a voluntary submission of a GRAS notice, then you're covered, no need there either. Also, certain substances are considered GRAS due to being natural biological origin, consumed before 1958. 1958 is a date that you see mentioned a lot because that's when a lot of the initial rulemaking around food additives started being produced. So as long as it's, from a natural biological orange, and sorry, I say orange because that's what's on the brain. Like nobody's going to ask for a GRAS notice for an orange, but it's important that this is spelled out. Natural biological origin with conventional processing, those are going to be exempted as well. Also, if you had a voluntary consultation, think of things like, the animal cell culture products without FDA expecting or recommending a GRAS notice, you're okay. For food contact substances, you see a lot for threshold of regulation exemptions, or if you have a food contact notification, you're in the clear. And then also because this does impact animal feed and there aren't necessarily a lot of actual regulations for animal feed, a lot of what we find in animal and pet food is coming out of the official publication of AFCO, the Association of American Feed Control Officials. And so those substances, if there's a definition there, then you won't have to file the GRAS notice. And then finally, if a company does submit details under the time-limited option that's outlined in subpart F of the regulation, those won't require the mandatory GRAS notice either.
So Anna, let's stick on the last thing you mentioned, subpart F. What is the time-limited option under subpart F?
So this is that streamlined process that I mentioned earlier. And so this is specific to GRAS substances that are on the marketplace when that final rule is issued. Ones that were self-affirmed by the manufacturers, so they never filed a GRAS notice. And so if your substance was self-affirmed and on the marketplace, then you're just going to only have to submit some basic information so that FDA is aware of its presence. So it's pretty simple and straightforward. It's your name and address, the name of the substance. You'll include information about the intended use, including, the types of food in which it's used, the levels at which it's used, and also its purpose or function. You do, though, have to present evidence of presence in interstate commerce before the effective date of that final rule to show that it should be part of this streamlined process. Also, if you had submitted a GRAS notice for it and then asked FDA to cease to evaluate that, you have to present that information to FDA, which, to be honest, might be a little bit of a red flag to FDA because you sort of dodged that GRAS notice earlier and then just continued to market it. Also, you can inform, but it's not required, FDA whether or not your basis for the GRAS status is common use in food or scientific procedures. But what's interesting is that for this time-limited option under subpart F, there's no data requirements. Now, one of the things it's important to know is that when the final rule passes and you have that effective date, within a year is when you can submit for the streamlined process. Otherwise, you lose this option. You also need to be aware that FDA may ask questions and can issue a determination that you do in fact have to submit a GRAS notice or a food additive petition. These will be posted to a public list, and this is kind of part of that whole criticism about visibility of what's in our food supply. So there'll be a public list of all of these, but know that that's not a confirmation that FDA has found it to be GRAS. And so I think all of this is designed to give FDA better visibility into what's being marketed in our food products in the US.
When is a company prohibited from using the streamlined pathway in subpart F?
So if you had submitted a GRAS notice and FDA actually found that there was an insufficient basis for a GRAS conclusion, you can't do the streamlined subpart F pathway. You're going to have to file the formal GRAS notice with sufficient data. Also, if there's ever been a case where FDA made a formal determination that your substance is not GRAS, then there's no choice. You're going to have to do either a food additive petition or that GRAS notice.
So Anna, if a company finds itself in that position, are there any new requirements from the GRAS notice process itself other than being mandatory?
So, interestingly, most of the details did stay the same. However, there were some changes. first, most people sent them in electronically, but there was the ability to send in paper copies, but no more. They got rid of that. You're going to have to send it in using the centralized online submission module where a lot of FDA submissions go. If you want to actually send in a paper copy, then you're going to have to actually apply for a waiver in order to do that. Also, it was always kind of understood that you needed to send in your data in English, but a lot of people would send it in documentation that was in a foreign language. Now, if you do that, you do have to present an English translation to FDA. And what's really interesting, and most notably, is that FDA is imposing some timelines upon itself. So they didn't used to be in regulation. The only real timelines was when a notice was filed, you had a 180-day response time where FDA would give you an answer within 180 days. And there was one 90-day extension that it could grant itself. So now, when they receive a GRAS notice from a company, they are giving themselves a 45-day window to decide whether or not they will file it. And they have a 2-day window to inform you whether or not they will file it after that 45-day window. So if they do file it, then you'll have the 180-day timeline, but now they can grant themselves 2 different 90-day extensions to complete the review process. Now, it's important to understand is that if it's filed, then your notification requirement is considered to be met. However, it will be invalidated and the requirement considered not met if you request that FDA cease to evaluate it after the filing. So under the voluntary process before, if you asked FDA to cease to evaluate your GRAS notice, you can still market it. That's been taken away. So unlike before, if you ask for it to be the FDA to cease evaluating it, then you cannot market it. You're going to have to refile or provide whatever information FDA is asking for.
And I'm sure everyone's wondering about the consequences. So, what are the consequences of failing to comply with the mandatory notification requirement?
So this is kind of an interesting part of the rule. So there's a heavy focus on scrutiny, but there is a question of how FDA plans to enforce this. The regulation itself only states that FDA will use this noncompliance as a key factor in prioritizing that substance for post-market review. It doesn't say, that they're going to go send the U.S. Marshals to your door. So FDA, independent of this, has been conducting a post-market review of some of these controversial chemicals. So it seems that they will add it to the list. And if FDA does determine that a substance is not GRAS, then legally it's an unapproved food additive. And it makes the food in which it's being incorporated adulterated, and technically does expose the company to enforcement actions, which could include warning letters, import detentions, and product procedures. But the question really is what will FDA actually do? And so we're kind of in a wait and see what FDA's plans are for enforcing this mandatory notification requirement, and will they have the resources to do it?
In summation, that it's a ton of detail, and obviously you've taken your time to go through this massive document. What would your advice be for the industry now? Like, what can they do to prepare for this?
So I think it's really, really important because this is the time where comments can be submitted, that industry read it very carefully and consider the ramifications of what FDA is proposing. I think it's really helpful to coordinate with other companies within your industry, align with trade groups and other types of associations to perhaps, present a united front, coordinate your efforts. A lot of times there's power when these groups find something, if there's something really objectionable in the rule, to go ahead and coordinate with each other to present a united front to FDA. Because FDA on occasion will make significant changes to proposed rules before a final rule comes out, if industry can present a rationale as to why that should be done. It's also important to pay attention to those timelines. 18 months is not a lot of time to pull together a GRAS notice. And even for your self-affirmed substances that are currently in the marketplace, there's only that 1-year window to submit the information about it. So really, really important to evaluate your product portfolios now, see which of your ingredients might be exempt and which ones might fall under the that streamlined subpart F submission requirement. So again, check your ingredients, see if they're already covered by a no questions letter from FDA from a GRAS notice. Look and see if they're listed as already being affirmed by FDA as GRAS in 182, 184, or 186. Do note, though, that you have to make sure that the uses within the regulation align with how you're using that particular substance. And again, you may have a substance that's considered GRAS due to being of natural biological origin, or if it's being used and is cited in 184 or 186 with no limits other than good manufacturing practices. All of these, you want to really do a thorough evaluation of your product portfolio so that you can then set up an action plan for how to move forward once this final rule comes out. And of course, if you have questions, please do feel like you can reach out. Our team has a lot of experience in this area. Our email address is regulatory.compliance.na@mxns.com. And we're absolutely here to serve as a resource for industry to help them through this monumental shift in food ingredient regulation.
Anna, once again, just thank you for your expertise and again for taking the time to boil that massive document down into some simple, straight shooting information. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
I'm sure you and I will be talking about this sometime again in the near future. So
I
I look
imagine
forward to
so.
that.
I imagine so. Always happy to do so.
Thanks, Anna. And everyone else listening, thank you very much for tuning in to Lab to Table, and we'll see you next time.